I'm not an oncologist. I'm not even sure if that's exactly the right person to ask about cancer. So I'm mildly qualified to talk about some of these details. I'll share what I have learned in some of my research, and I'll share some of those conclusions and hedge them appropriately. I got interested in this topic when a friend was utterly convinced that 3 cases of cancer in his family meant something was up. And maybe it would be. I can't comment on that situation. But it got me looking into this topic of cancer clusters. So let's consider an area, talk about what cluster even means to begin with. This is the state of Nevada, or its outline at least. And I'm going to show you some hypothetical data. This is not real data yet, but let's imagine that all these circles represent the incidence of cancer in, let's say, the last 6 months in Nevada. A casual look at this would say, ooh, there's 2 clusters here, right? What's going on in those areas? Why is there so much cancer centered in these 2 locations? Well, there would actually be a very simple explanation for that. I can see from a few smiles that some of you have gotten the punchline already. It's because those are the 2 major population centers of the state. So naturally you would expect that most cancers would be found where most people are found. What would actually be weirder, what would be surprising to me, would be if it looked like this. You know, what seemingly looks like a random distribution is actually the weird one, because why are there so few people in the populous areas getting cancer, and why are there so many rural people getting cancer? So the chart on the left is kind of what you would expect, which really tells us the goal here is not to look at the quantity or the frequency of something, but the incidence rate. Incidence rate is like the number of people per 100,000 typically that would get something. So quick aside, I looked up that the number of people who have celiac disorder, gluten insensitivity, is about 1 in 250. So you should know maybe 1 person that has that. I know about 30 people who claim to have it, so some of them are mistaken, presumably. Cancer clusters do exist. Doesn't mean everyone who says that there is a cancer cluster is correct. We should be skeptical and scientific about it, but here are 5 good examples I won't go into deep detail with. Some of them might be familiar to you because they all made headlines at different points. But broadly speaking, there are industrial, let's call them accidents, maybe industrial incompetence or whatever the case may be. There are many situations, very sad situations, when lots of people develop cancers through no fault of their own, but because they were exposed to mercury or contaminated drinking water and these sorts of things. So this is a serious topic. People should take these claims seriously and look into them, I think. How seriously is a case-by-case issue, and we'll talk about some of that. So I'm going to focus on 2 claims today. One in a town called Colonia in New Jersey, and another in a town called Woburn in Massachusetts. Both of these places have strong claims of a cancer cluster, and I'll spoil some of the punchline. One of them seems to be real, and one of them does not seem to be a real cluster. So the story of one, let's start with Colonia, New Jersey on the left. This really begins with a guy named Al Lupiano. At age 27, back in '99, he was diagnosed with brain cancer, specifically acoustic neuroma. So, sad situation, very young to get something like that. Obviously survived, that's not a 27-year-old there, that's a more modern picture. Another sad thing came to Al's situation in 2021. First, his wife was diagnosed with the same cancer, and 2 hours later, his sister was diagnosed with GBM, something much more serious. And this sent Al on a little investigation saying, why are so many people, also his wife, they went to high school together, as did the sister. Why are all these people at this high school getting cancers? Went on a little investigative tour. So August 2021, that dual diagnosis, his wife and sister both diagnosed same day, and he begins research. He finds 12 other cases. He always says 15, but I'm assuming that's himself, the sister, and the wife, so 3 plus 12 is 15. Next year, March 7th, he puts out a public appeal on Facebook and some other sites, some of the local things, saying, hey, is there anyone else from Colonia High who maybe has some of these diagnoses? I'm just trying to collect data. Which, good job, collect data, always collect data. March 29th, exposure's grown. He gets on CBS Local News and reports by then they have 65 identified cases, just a few months later. A few weeks after that, the list, according to a post on something called heavy.com, we're up to 120 individuals. Back on CBS News, April 26, 115. And finally, the biggest number I could find, May 17, just half a year later. They have 120 people he's identified who all went to this high school between a certain range of time and who have all developed brain cancer of some kind. So, obviously concerning to him. This is one of the particular reports that I reviewed. 3 quotes from Al here. He says we're up to 120 people. They're all alumni, teachers, or staff at the high school. Okay. They all have a primary brain tumor, both malign and malignant, which I think are the 2 categories. So all of them, I guess. But that's a lot of cases, certainly from this point of view. In fact, just as a weird aside, they found a radioactive rock at the school. They sent in these hazmat guys to get rid of it. So I don't know. Could be that there's something going on here. So what do these 120 cases all share? Like I said, they all had brain tumors of some kind. Tumors were either benign or malignant, both kinds. And the alumni, the brain that he's looking at are 75 to 95. Now first, is that exclusionary? Is it that we're drawing, our bullseye in the range that's most, capturing most cases? What's happened after 95? I mean, maybe the rock was removed and that was the source. Or maybe these are things that develop at an adult age. I wouldn't penalize for that too much, just a detail about it. And then going into some more medical literature, trying to get the base rates I was mentioning. What is the background rate on average across the country? 6.2 per 100,000 people will get primary malign brain and central nervous tumors. And then if we look at the malign and not malign, we get about 25.34 per 100,000 people. So much less prevalent than celiac disorder. You may or may not know someone who has this, but those are our numbers to work with. Let's jump to our second case. This is Woburn, Massachusetts. There's a young boy named Jimmy Anderson. He's diagnosed with childhood leukemia. That's his, I believe him there and his mother Ann. Ann is sort of the Al Lupiano of this story. She started to get suspicious, do some investigatory work, and identified that there were elevated leukemia cases for children. There were 12 they found, 120 to 12, and this was in a range of 69 to 86. Really rose similar concerns in the community, and people are, upset. We don't want a lot of high rates of childhood leukemia. So of course, in situations like this, you start looking for the cause. What's going on in Woburn? What's going on in Colonial? Is there something environmental? Is there something industrial? Can we find the cause? So Woburn's timeline. 1969 is when this the first related diagnosis occurs. It's not Jimmy, I don't think, but it's the first in this story, so to speak. In 73, that's when Jimmy's mother Ann starts raising her concerns, going out in the community, doing a little research. Just a few years later, the locals are noticing there is an unusual odor and taste in the drinking water. And that's a picture of some of the drinking water, I'm told, from the time, having a hard time verifying the photo. But also, that's how my water looks sometimes in many places I've lived. So I don't know what exactly to make of that. But I do know same year, 1979, the CDC starts investigating. 3 years later, a lawsuit is filed against a local big manufacturing company. Doesn't mean that there's an actual cause here, it just means a lawsuit was filed. And it took till 96 before that trial concluded.
1896?
Oh, great typo, yeah. Sorry, we'll get to the time travel.
Time travel.
Yeah.
Paradox, yeah.
Yeah.
That will cause it, I understand.
Oh, yeah, time travel is known to have an effect that causes tumors. You don't want to time travel. So forward only. Backwards is the tumor case. So what do the 12 Woburn cases share? Not a high school, but they're all children. They all have childhood leukemia. They're all residents in that area. And the incidence rate here is 4.7 per 100,000. So somewhat rare, but hopefully medical science can drive that downward. And now a quick show of hands with the data I've given you so far. Anybody who thinks Woburn is a real cancer cluster? Or maybe an imagined one? Versus Colonia? All right.
I'm not sure either.
Good to not see many hands actually, because we don't necessarily know yet. I got to this point and said, There are confirmed cases. You know, I didn't call the doctors and confirm that no one's making it up, but just trusting all these diagnoses. That's a lot of people having these rare disorders. We should be concerned, we should look into it. So now it's my favorite part of the presentation. It's time to calculate.
Do we have to do that? We're gonna get a pencil and paper out?
You can double check me if you'd like, yeah. Is Woburn, Massachusetts, this incidence of childhood leukemia, is this beyond coincidence? Because of course, if you think about it, childhood leukemia exists, some children will get it, and by chance, some of those children will live in the same city. There must be one city in the country that has the highest number of cases. You would think it'd be New York or something like that, but there has to be a city that has the most. Is it Woburn or is it somewhere else? So 12 cases, just in a vacuum seems like a small number, but a small concerning number. So we're going to do some very basic arithmetic here. Calculate the expected cases. What would we presume to find if this was just a statistical anomaly? What you might call H0 or the null hypothesis. So the expected cases is the total population times that incidence rate, which is, give you the number of cases you should see in that year, and then the years at risk. So in this case, it's 18 years, given that time range of 69 to 86. And I didn't really know how many children lived in Woburn at the time. That was a little bit hard to research. Census doesn't capture that precisely. So I got some good estimates, partially with the help of ChatGPT. We're going to estimate the population of children is somewhere between 5,400 and 9,000. Those numbers could be changed, and you could get your own calculation if you'd like. But doing all the math, we would expect between 4.5 cases and just under 8 cases. But we have 12. And that's a statistical anomaly, and truthfully that was. Woburn had an industrial situation where these two particular chemicals, I won't try to pronounce, TCE and PCE, were contaminating groundwater. This was due to this local food company, W.R. Gray's company, or Beatrice Foods, one acquired the other, something like that. A very sad situation when the industry did cause, seemingly for sure did cause these cases, or at least elevated them. There's a book about it called The Civil Action by John Harr, and a movie I haven't seen yet that covers the case as well. Real cancer cluster. Now let's go back to Colonia High. All these people had brain tumors, 120 of them, that seems like a lot, for a small town especially. Tumors are either benign or malignant, so all tumors. They were all alumni from that range, and I couldn't get exact figures on enrollment. I got some hints that maybe this high school was a lot bigger in the time period back in the 70s, but I could get more modern data, so from 2003 to 2007, enrollment was right in the 1,300 to 1,500 range. So let's again take a range. Maybe the student population was as low as 1,100, perhaps it was as high as 2,500. That would give us a range over that time period of somewhere between 22,000 and 50,000 students. And then talking around to a few people trying to get an estimate of, well, how many staff people could that be? A couple of people I talked to who worked at schools gave me a range of about 200 to 500, so an order of magnitude lower than the students themselves. I'm going to kind of skip that and just go with the student number. 120 reported cases. Let's do the math. Population of Colonia High, or specifically the student population, those that went through. Oh, and this is an interesting aside. So you think, how does the small town have, the population of Colonia is not 50,000 people, I don't think. But there are new people coming in and people leaving all the time. High school turns over every 4 years, or at least it should if they're graduating. So you do see a larger population when you look on a horizon than if you just say how many kids are there today. So that's how we get to these much larger population numbers. That's your attendance base. And we should expect between maybe 111 cases or 253 cases or so. So 120 cases is only slightly above the low estimate of what we would expect to find there anyways in any community of this size. Does that mean that there is no cancer cluster there? No, it doesn't. It's an indication that maybe there isn't, or maybe this is just a typical background rate, but at this point, it's starting to get skeptical about it. Let's do a quick comparison. We have a much larger case base in Colonia, Colonia on the left, didn't label that, Woburn on the right. But the Woburn expectation is much lower than the reported cases, versus in Colonia, where the reported cases really falls within the expected range. In both situations, they did a deep environmental investigation. Go out, soil samples, water samples, check for asbestos. They did all these sorts of things. Maybe one was better than the other in their checking, but pretty extensive checks were done. In the case of Woburn, they found these industrial solvents that were coming from that one particular factory. In Colonia, they haven't found anything, pending that rock situation. This is Sean Tourette. He is the Commissioner, New Jersey Department of Environmental Protection. Quoting him from a press release after all those investigations were done, he says, "We are confident in the we have confidence in the examination." Oh, I wish Sean was here to do it. "We have confidence in the examination that was done here." So either he's part of the conspiracy, he's a ring, or he's correct. So Lupiano's position after all this, and this is the point where Lupiano starts to disappoint me, because prior to this, he was doing great work, doing the research, getting out in the community, let's talk, let's collect cases, and let's report it up to experts. But when asked after all this came out, do you believe there's a direct link between the school and brain tumors diagnosed in people? 2 quotes. "While there is a lack of evidence to say substantially yes, there's also a lack of evidence pointing in any other direction." Well, any other direction is a stretch. It's true there could still be some unknown cause. Maybe the environmental investigation failed to identify it, or maybe the cause was removed and there's a conspiracy. But without any other direction, he's kind of saying, let's assume it's true because we can't prove it false. And second quote, "Until we've asked those questions and done those tests, we have to think there's a possibility that there is a link to the school." And I agree, there's a possibility, however remote, just not one that's been established. So in Woburn, we have a clear what's called mechanism of action. There were industrial solvents dumped into the water system, a known way to cause cancer in a population. In Colonia High, they got nothing. So in addition to the statistics, which I'm comfortable speaking about, saying that there doesn't seem to be anything beyond expectation here, they also haven't found anything here. So let's talk about a few related logical fallacies that come into play here. One that's sort of related is called moving the goalpost. So Lupiano is not guilty here. I got to applaud the guy for that. The cancer cases he looked at always remained brain cancer. He didn't say, oh, now we all got pancreatic cancer we're going to count too, and we've got this other cancer we're going to count too, and broaden the net, and suddenly your number gets bigger. That didn't happen in this case, which is good. The population always was about the students and the employees of the school, and the category remained just brain cancer. So, good job here. Then there's confirmation bias, and what ChatGPT thought was a good image to describe confirmation bias. The idea that, put yourself, be sympathetic, put yourself in Lupiano's shoes for a minute. You're a cancer survivor. The same day, 2 of the closest people to you are diagnosed. You all went to the same high school. You start talking. More and more cases come out at your high school. It would certainly feel like you're onto something. That's essentially a confirmation bias, something the human brain is prone to do, but the statistics will tell us is not the case. Another one is the sharpshooter's fallacy. That the idea being, you go out and you shoot the gun first and draw your target, draw your bullseye after you hit. And in a situation like that, if you're convinced there's a problem and you keep looking, you find confirmatory evidence. And another related idea, I'm sure most people are familiar with, the birthday paradox. So just to play it out visually, on the x-axis here across the bottom is the number of people in the room. So, I don't know, are there maybe 30 of us here at the moment? So trace up from 30, there's a 70% chance 2 people in this room share a birthday. If you think from only your perspective, that seems weird, because it should seem like there's a 1 in 365 chance someone shares your birthday. Or worse, if you were born February 29th. But, on average, it's not about you, it's about the population in the room. So these are, an idea that's sort of obvious statistically, but is not innate in common sense. So I was able to look at this statistically. I was able to look at some of the analysis, comment on like, did they do the right statistical tests? Are these reasonable incidence rates? I have a background to do that. Not everyone does. So what can someone who doesn't have that same background do to look at this? If you don't know oncology, as I don't, and you also don't know statistics, first thing is Hyman's categorical imperative, the idea that before you assume something happened, check to see if it even occurred. In that case, I would say this is true here. All these cancer cases seem to be real. I don't think anyone lied or made them up. So that's a pass. Second question I think the average non-statistician should ask is, what would the null hypothesis be? So your hypothesis, or Lupiano's hypothesis, is that there's a cancer cluster at my high school. But what would it mean for there to be cancers there, but no cluster, no centralized common cause? And that's that background rate, that base rate, that, 4.7 out of 100,000 children will get childhood leukemia, and the similar numbers for brain cancers. It's a sad reality that that's always part of any population. So are you above or below the expected rate? Third, and maybe most important, is there a mechanism of action? We don't seem to get cancer from out of the blue. That's not true. I guess people sort of do kind of get it out of the blue, but you can also get it from a causal situation. So if you're going to propose that my high school is causing many of the students and alumni and all that to get cancer, there has to be something at that high school that's different. And when we look and it's not there, we have no mechanism of action. Is there a baseline rate I can compare against? And this is a tool, even if you're not a statistician, you can always ask about. I'm reminded of the missing 411 conspiracy that I presented a few years ago, where David Polich says, you know, there are all these missing persons cases in national parks. It's so strange what's going on. There must be mysterious origin. But it is a sad fact that people do go missing. So at what rate, we have to first ask. And how does the data you're looking at compare to that base rate? A similar thing can be said about like car accidents. They're a sad fact of life. There are going to be car accidents as long as there are cars. Well, maybe the self-driving will fix it, who knows. But between now and then, there are going to be car accidents. So if you're saying, gee, I've been hearing and noticing a lot of car accidents lately, that's an interesting thought to explore. Doesn't mean something's going on. Unless you're the bad driver causing them. You know, what is the base rate? How many in the last 5 years car accidents have we seen? These are the types of questions that will illuminate how to look at the statistic you're investigating. And then, of course, appeal to expertise is not a good thing, but I like the idea of appealing to a consensus of experts. So one person in a vacuum saying, you know, I'm a civil engineer and I can guarantee you there's no reason all these kids should have cancer, doesn't tell me a lot. But when there are a variety of environmental investigators who go in and look for asbestos and chemicals and this and that, and everyone agrees there's no causal mechanism here, it seems to be the case that they're on the right track. So my conclusions, as I mentioned, I'm not an epidemiologist, I can't, or an oncologist or that sort of thing. I can't look at the direct medical claims, but I do have a strong understanding of their models. I know how they look at data, how they calculate statistics, and I can evaluate those sorts of things with my background. Now, this is a famous quote. Is Arlen here yet? You might want to use this one. It's attributed to a guy named George Box. Turns out he didn't say it, like a lot of famous quotes, but all models are wrong, but some are useful. So while the statistical models describing the situation, could there be something off about them? Maybe. Could a more sophisticated model confirm that there's a cancer cluster here? Maybe, but someone would first have to propose that model and convince me that it's a good model and that its reading of the data is telling us that there's something going on. And that hasn't happened. Another point here, corporations can be evil, or they can be incompetent. So there's always the possibility of some chemical leak or some cover-up or some actual cause being out there, but those sorts of things do tend to leave fingerprints, even in the case of a cover-up. And in Colonia, where there's no evidence of any of that, it's more stacking towards the case that probably this is a series of unfortunate coincidences. Data collection is almost always a good thing. That's why I say I think Lupiano, up to a point, was doing a good job. Go out and educate the community, raise this concern, get feedback, collect data, collect cases. But you're also, in that case, collecting with sort of a bias. I doubt if he kept a record of how many people got back to him and said, no cancer in my family, because why would you reply and say, yeah, I went to that high school, but I'm doing great. Only the people who have cancer or who have a family member who got cancer are going to respond. So he's getting a strong selection bias, but that's okay too. He did data collection, he handed it over to the experts. The experts made an expert evaluation and didn't seem to find anything for it. So having looked through all this, it seems to be that Colonial High School does not have a cancer cluster, or at least it certainly hasn't been established yet. There's always the possibility of new evidence, but we're not there today. And while Woburn, with only just those 12 cases, was enough to tell us, yes, there is a problem here, there is a cancer cluster, we know that because the statistics tell us that, and because they found those chemical solvents in the environment, and there's a natural progression from those solvents in drinking water to cancer. So we have a clear A leads to B leads to C in Woburn that we don't have in Colonial. So that's the end of this. I've gone through a couple other cases of these. I may redo the presentation and kind of customize it to local areas. I may do this in Nevada where we have Fallon. That's an interesting cancer cluster claim to look at. I could not find any near Salinas, so
Yay!
yeah, I guess you guys are lucky or not doing your data collection. But in any event, cancer clusters are real, and when you hear these claims, I think we should always take them seriously. You've got to invest an appropriate amount of effort looking for it. I think that went on in Colonia. And there are some guiding principles for even non-statisticians to look at this. In my mind, the most important one being that mechanism of action. What would be the cause of it? And the absence of a cause, absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, but it strongly suggests it, especially in cases like this. Thank you.
We have time for questions. If anybody wants to come up and ask questions, it'd be nice if you ask at the microphone. If you're not comfortable doing that, Kyle can repeat the question. It's just for the audio. Questions? I have questions. I was going to ask about we talked about this yesterday, about, I can talk out of it, it's not. There?
It's the silver one.
Got it?
The silver one. This one?
Yep.
Nope. Okay, I touched something I shouldn't have touched. I'm sure it's going to make it all a mess.
I'll fix it.
All right. So we were talking about this yesterday. Is that all right? We were talking about this briefly. I wanted to point out we had never had a septic council Kyle who was going to talk. And it's amazing because he doesn't live here. So he lived for a really long time in Los Angeles and he would drive 5 or 6 hours up here just to do a talk for us. It was always phenomenal. Thank you so much, Kyle.
Thank you.
You've always done a fabulous job. Always say it very much. He does have a podcast called Data Skeptic if you're interested in data statistics. Yeah, wonderful podcast. He explains things in understandable ways that me with a history degree can understand. So the question I was going to ask you is, what is the responsibility of we've heard of the companies that sue. I'm thinking of Johnson & Johnson and the Roundup, glyphosate. Yeah, and so there's a panic. People have a panic saying that there must be something because you heard all over the news. And what is the responsibility of that towards causing fear in a community? And also I was wondering if you knew the outcome of the one that they did go to trial in 89, or 1898 or whatever it was.
Which one?
The first one you mentioned. They had a trial.
Oh yeah.
Do you have an answer?
The trial, as most trials I think are, was kind of complicated. It was essentially ruled, not that the courtroom is the arbiter of science, but in this case it seemed to align. The court agreed there was negligence and that sort of thing. There was some sort of award, because clearly there was a link here. Of the two companies, like one acquired the other and the acquirer didn't know, so like the parent company was acquitted, not that companies are acquitted, but complex legal system where at the end of the day there was some award to those families. I can't say if it was enough, really outside my realm to say anyways, but yes, the trial came out in favor of the science, I guess is one way to put it.
And so about the companies who say, they do these big mass, if you have Zantac or whatever that causes the scare in the first place, and people, they just pay out because...
Yeah, this is something I'm torn about. It's sort of like almost illegal bullying. You can get like an ambulance chasing lawyer who says like, oh, I have a class action lawsuit, I just gotta make the class as big as I can. I mean, that's outside of my domain to say what's right or wrong. I would hope it could as closely align with science as possible. In terms of your question about fear, should we scare a community? That's a tricky one because I think data collection is always a good thing, or almost always a good thing. So if you think, hey, I live in this area, there's farming and there's Roundup and maybe that's causing bad situations, let's get the data first. You know, let's collect the reports. Maybe those reports are biased, but that can be accounted for too somewhat statistically. So should a community be made afraid? I would hope not. I would hope data collection is not a scary thing. We're just asking questions. But you're right, just saying like, hey, have you had, dihydrogen oxide? You know, that's in your water. There's perhaps a way that these questions should be asked in a better manner that is communicative to the community better. A little outside of my domain. And a lot of those cases, it's also, again, a question of mechanism of action. Is it plausible that Roundup causes health issues? I don't know, and I'm not qualified to say. I can look at the data once it's collected, though. Robin?
One of the things I always think about when I think about that subject is, shouldn't we be looking at the people who are employees who handle these chemicals?
Sure.
So like if you're talking about amalgam fillings in the dentist, I would look at the dentist. Who probably have the most exposure when they're putting amalgam filling, putting their data first.
Good point.
See if you can make a connection if that's a mechanism.
Yeah, more or less the dose response curve, you know?
Repeat it, Kyle.
Oh, so look at like there are claims that some dental fillings, and I believe this is true, are bad for many people, and I believe those have been phased out. But then going back in time, there's different forms of exposure. There's the person who had the bad dental filling, there's also the dentist, or the people working at the factory that make the filling. And they should all have some sort of response, presumably. So dose response is something you look at in medicine a lot. You know, if you take a half a Tylenol versus a full Tylenol, presumably the full Tylenol is going to help people more. But there's a curve to that too. When you take 1,000 Tylenol, it probably kills you. So if in the case of the high school, you have maybe an interesting, what do they call it, natural experiment. Students that dropped out or transferred were there only 1 year. Does that population have a lower rate of cancer exposure? I presume from this data that it would be equivalent because there does not seem to be an underlying effect here. But there are lots of interesting things like that we can look at just in terms of the raw data. How many people were exposed, how many people claim to have something before even the environmental stuff begins, which can be expensive and difficult and all that. So yeah, I think there's just some common sense tools that can be used, like who else was exposed, what would we expect in these situations?
So one of the sources that you cited for looking at population in these small towns was ChatGPT.
Right.
Well, ChatGPT has a well-known phenomenon called hallucination.
True.
Given that you cited that as your source, can I just discount all of your analysis?
Good question. So can we discount some of the analysis because I asked ChatGPT for a little help? And because we know ChatGPT does have this phenomenon of hallucinating. So a couple things on that. Hallucinations are real and true. ChatGPT will make stuff up, but increasingly less and less. The engineers that work on those tools are working hard to make them not hallucinate, unless you want them to, right? If you're like a fiction writer, you want to turn hallucination up to the max and have dragons and all types of stuff happening. But you know, it's an option we should control in these large language models. So two things on should we discount it? Well, I did verify those numbers through a couple sources. The real question was how many children lived in the population in a certain period of time, which is hard to establish a firm fact. But interestingly, ChatGPT did give me a citation. It said, I think it was city data or some site. I clicked it, it was a real link, and the fact that it shared was from that link. So maybe it passed along a false link. At least I didn't put InfoWars, but yeah, trust but verify, I guess.
And what about the rock? The radioactive rock, did they?
The rock is the loose thread I haven't been able to follow up on. Nobody seemed as surprised by it as me. My take on it is that there was probably a low-level rock, some sort of thing. Like I'm aware there were like science kits you could buy in the 60s that would actually have like a tiny amount of uranium in it, and it's like a big no-no today. But I think it was something like that, like a science class had this artifact somehow, and at some point it was identified that there was radiation exposure and they got it out of there. I'm certainly not an expert in that area, but I know we're always getting radiated. It's a matter of the frequency and how often you're exposed to it and that sort of thing. So if anyone was going to be harmed, it would be presumably the science teacher whose room it was in.
Right.
They had 8 hours a day exposure. So from that point, that teacher didn't become part of the story. I presume the rock was of a benign and minor impact, but wanted to share it for completeness.
Any other questions? We're doing well on time? If not, I want to thank Kyle. This is a joke, but I just can never remember his name, which is Kyle. It's just a joke. I know his real name. Kyle.
Indeed.
Yeah, thank you. So thank you so much. If you want to get